Hey, I'm Austin. Today we are covering stories where people get attacked by wild animals on camera, from a photographer who stepped into the territory of a 14-foot alligator during mating season, to a luxury proposal in Botswana that was supposed to went viral for another reason. Let's begin with an influencer searching for the perfect sunset shot on a Bahamas sandbar where a deadly predator was already circling nearby. It was July 21, 2020 near South Bimini, Bahamas. The evening tide was rising, pushing water across a shallow sandbar right next to a deep drop-off. Tourists were enjoying the calm sunset, completely unaware that beneath the surface, the tide was turning the area into a hunting ground for bait fish and predators. That evening, 22-year-old Evan Pitt stood ankle-deep on a sandbar off Bimini while the last light of the day turned the water gold. A few boats drifted nearby. Tourists snapped photos from the shallows, and from a distance it looked like one of those places that seems almost too perfect to be dangerous. Back home in Fort Pierce, Florida, Evan worked long hours as a dockhand unloading fishing boats and hauling equipment. The work was tough, but it paid the bills. What he really wanted was to build something online. For nearly 2 years, he'd been posting videos whenever he could, nothing outrageous. Mostly fishing trips, travel clips, and small challenges with friends. But like a lot of creators, he kept waiting for that one video that might finally get noticed. During a weekend trip to the Bahamas with his roommate Nolan, Evan saw an opportunity. The sandbar offered incredible views, especially near sunset when the water became almost crystal clear. His plan was simple: film himself walking across the exposed flats while the sun dropped toward the horizon. And honestly, that's what makes this story unsettling to me. There wasn't some crazy stunt involved. Plenty of people would have looked at the same situation and thought it seemed perfectly reasonable. The problem was where the sandbar sat. Just beyond the shallow flats was a deep tidal channel, the kind of place local boat operators generally knew to be cautious around near sunset. Bait fish were actively breaking the surface. Later, investigators learned that at least one nearby operator had been warning visitors about bull shark activity along the drop-off in the days prior, though whether Evan heard or heeded those warnings is unclear. Bull sharks are especially dangerous because they don't always stay in deep water. Adults commonly grow between 7 and 10 feet long and regularly move into shallow coastal areas where people swim and wade. They're aggressive, opportunistic predators and are responsible for a significant number of serious shark attacks worldwide. As the evening went on, the tide slowly crept higher across the flats. Water that had been around his ankles earlier was now reaching his knees in some places. Nolan continued recording while Evan moved farther from shore, trying different camera angles and retaking shots whenever something didn't look right. Then Nolan noticed something. A large shadow moved along the edge of the channel. It didn't rush toward them. It didn't thrash the surface. It simply cruised through deeper water before disappearing again. And this is the part where I would have been done. The second I see a shadow the size of a kayak moving beneath me, the video is over. But Evan stayed. A few minutes later, the water beside him exploded. Witnesses later described seeing a large shark surge out of deeper water and strike him with tremendous force. The impact spun him sideways and knocked him off balance. His scream carried across the flats, drawing the attention of people on nearby boats. When Evan tried to stand, his right leg gave out. The shark had bitten high into his thigh, severing major blood vessels. Blood quickly spread through the water as Nolan rushed to him, yelling for help. Nearby boaters immediately headed toward the sandbar and helped pull Evan from the shallows. What many people don't realize is that a single shark bite can be fatal if it hits the wrong place. Severe damage to a major artery can cause a person to bleed out within minutes. Evan was rushed back to shore, where emergency crews were waiting, but the blood loss was too severe. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward from injuries to major vessels in his upper thigh. Clips recorded during the incident were not released to the public and were kept for further investigation. But if the Bahamas showed what can happen in seconds, the Florida Everglades prove something even more unsettling. Sometimes the warnings are impossible to miss, and people still walk straight toward them. It was March 15, 2019. The Florida Everglades are quiet, but they are never truly still. By mid-March, the dry season is nearing its peak. Water levels shrink across parts of the wetlands, concentrating fish, birds, and large predators into the same waterways. Near Flamingo, rangers had recently received multiple reports of an unusually large alligator repeatedly occupying a heavily used section of marsh. Local guides frequently reported sightings of a particularly large male alligator in the area. Estimates place the animal at roughly 11 to 12 feet long, making it one of the larger alligators regularly observed along several remote waterways. As water levels dropped during the dry season, sightings became more common near fishing routes and observation points. Rangers repeatedly reminded visitors to remain on designated trails and avoid approaching the shoreline for close photographs. But 28-year-old Cale Brennan chose to ignore them. Cale was a talented wildlife photographer known for getting closer than most people were comfortable with. Over the years, he had built a reputation for dramatic photographs captured from difficult angles and risky positions. Personally, I think that's where the problem started. Success had convinced Cale that he could safely operate closer to dangerous animals than everyone else. Before sunrise that morning, Cale and another photographer, Miranda Torres, hiked to a remote observation area overlooking a marsh channel. Kyle carried a telephoto lens but became frustrated by thick vegetation blocking his view. Despite Miranda warning him to stay back, he left the marked trail and moved closer to the water's edge, stepping through mud and shallow water along the bank to improve his angle. Miranda remained on higher ground several dozen yards away. Through her lens, she watched Cale continue inching closer to the shoreline where the large alligator had last been seen resting among reeds and fallen timber. Then, without warning, the water erupted. What happened next unfolded incredibly fast. Miranda later told investigators that the alligator appeared completely motionless one moment and was charging through the water the next. The distance vanished in seconds. Cale barely had time to react before the animal struck his lower body and knocked him backward into the marsh. And what terrifies me the most about apex predators is how fast that switch flips. 1 second you think you're looking at a harmless floating log, and the next, it's moving faster than you can blink. In my opinion, you just stand zero chance of processing it in time. The alligator clamped onto Cale's leg and immediately pulled him away from the shoreline. Miranda later told investigators she raised her camera instinctively during those first seconds, a reflex from years of field work, but quickly dropped it and began screaming for help. The struggle disappeared almost immediately behind vegetation and into the murky water. Witnesses later reported hearing Kyle shout once before he was dragged under. Kyle resurfaced a few times during the struggle before the alligator dragged him under to drown him. By the time emergency crews arrived 23 minutes later, it was already too late. To me, the most harrowing part of this story is that Miranda witnessed much of the attack, knowing there was virtually nothing she could do to stop it. Search teams later recovered Cale's remains from the marsh. Wildlife officers documented several large alligators living in the surrounding waterways, but investigators were unable to determine exactly which animal was responsible. In the weeks that followed, park officials increased warning signage, reinforced barriers near popular observation areas, and reminded visitors to remain on designated viewing platforms. Footage from the incident was kept private due to its high graphic content. The Everglades attack was about a man getting too close to a predator he could see. In Alaska, the danger was different. The animal was there the entire time, hidden in plain sight among the salmon-packed streams of Katmai. It was November 14, 2014, in the Masai Mara National Reserve, Kenya. The long dry season had turned much of the landscape into dusty grassland, forcing animals to gather around a shrinking network of waterholes. As evening approached, predators began moving through the reserve in search of food. 34-year-old Kira Westfield was working there as a wildlife researcher, part of a small independent team studying how predators behave around seasonal water sources. She had spent years documenting lions, leopards, and spotted hyenas across East Africa. By all accounts, she was talented, experienced, and respected by the people who worked alongside her. But honestly, if you ask me, I think deep experience can sometimes become its own kind of trap. The more often you get away with making a risky call, the easier it becomes to convince yourself those decisions are perfectly safe. Earlier that afternoon, Kira had documented a partially consumed wildebeest carcass located less than half a mile from a watering area frequented by several lion prides. Working from her vehicle, she photographed feeding patterns, collected a limited number of biological samples, and mapped scavenger activity around the site. None of that was unusual research work. The concern was that the carcass was still active. Rangers later noted that at least part of a pride was likely still using the area and would probably return once temperatures began cooling toward evening. And it's not like there weren't warning signs that week. Rangers had documented multiple lion sightings unusually close to vehicle tracks near the remaining water sources. Researchers, including Kira herself, had also noted that the ongoing drought was forcing large concentrations of prey animals into smaller areas. She had recorded those observations in her own field notes. Even so, she continued conducting field work on foot during the hours when lions typically become more active, away from the immediate safety of her vehicle. Personally, that's where it feels like confidence started overriding caution. Around 6:40 p.m., Kira was setting up a remote camera trap beside a game trail leading toward a watering hole. She was crouched beside the equipment, focused on adjusting the sensor alignment when a safari vehicle carrying tourists passed through the area roughly 120 yards away. The guide later reported seeing movement in the grass behind her. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then a lioness emerged from the vegetation. Seconds later, another appeared farther to Kira's right. Both remained low to the ground. According to witness accounts, the lions didn't appear startled or defensive. They seemed completely focused on her. And honestly, that's the image that gives me chills. Lions don't always roar or put on some dramatic display before an attack. Sometimes they simply stalk. Investigators later believed the lionesses had likely been watching Kira for several minutes before she noticed them. When she finally spotted the animals and abruptly stood up to gather her equipment, the movement may have convinced the lions that their opportunity was disappearing. One of the lionesses suddenly accelerated from the grass, covering the distance in only a few seconds. The impact knocked Kira to the ground. Before she could regain her footing, the lioness seized her around the shoulder and upper chest area. A second lion joined moments later. Witnesses later reported hearing a brief scream before the animals dragged her several yards into the grass. The safari guide immediately radioed emergency services and drove toward the scene. Vehicle horns, engine noise, and the presence of multiple closing vehicles eventually drove the lions away. It wasn't an instant response. It took several critical minutes for enough vehicles to arrive. By the time responders reached her, Kira had suffered catastrophic injuries. She was still alive, but barely, and died during evacuation. The post-mortem found severe trauma to the neck, shoulders, and chest, along with extensive blood vessel damage and massive blood loss. Investigators concluded she died from hemorrhagic shock caused by the attack. Investigators later reviewed nearby camera trap footage, witness statements, vehicle recordings, GPS data, and radio logs to reconstruct most of the encounter. Everything was kept private in respect of Kira's family. What really bothers me is that Kira knew the danger. She understood lion behavior better than most people ever will. She knew dusk was prime hunting time. She knew the drought was concentrating predators around shrinking water sources. And she knew an active carcass often meant lions were still nearby. And what I learned from Kira's story was that knowledge helps, but it doesn't make you invincible. Sometimes the danger isn't on land at all. Off the coast of South Africa, one split-second decision put a young videographer directly into the path of one of the ocean's most powerful predators. On September 23, 2021, the waters off Gansby were unusually calm. Fishing boats, sightseeing charters, and recreational vessels moved across the coastline beneath clear afternoon skies. The region had long been known for its population of large, great white sharks, and several sightings had already been reported by local operators that week. 29-year-old Noah Johnson had traveled to South Africa with his girlfriend, Elise, after a busy wedding season back home in Bristol. Noah ran a small videography business specializing in proposals, weddings, and travel content. Friends described him as creative, energetic, and constantly searching for ways to make each project more memorable than the last. During their trip, Noah booked a private charter near Gansby, hoping to capture dramatic footage of the coastline and marine wildlife. The area was famous for its rugged scenery, seals, and occasional sightings of great white sharks. Although shark attacks on people there were extremely rare, local crews still followed strict safety procedures around the water. That afternoon, the couple spent several hours filming along the coast. Conditions were calm, visibility was good, and the trip appeared to be going exactly as planned. As the boat drifted near a quiet stretch of coastline, Noah noticed that one of his action cameras had come loose from its mounting position near the stern. The camera remained attached by a short tether and was dragging just below the surface alongside the boat. The crew offered to retrieve it using a boat hook once they reached calmer water, but Noah worried the equipment might break loose entirely or become damaged. Looking back, that's the moment that stands out to me. The camera wasn't irreplaceable. The trip was already a success, but sometimes people convince themselves they need to fix a small problem immediately. Noah stepped down onto the rear swim platform while the vessel was idling, moving quickly before the crew could redirect him. By the time a crew member turned to check the stern, Noah had already lowered himself into the water. Witnesses later said he recovered the camera almost immediately and turned back toward the boat. Then witnesses heard him yell. Several passengers later reported seeing a large splash followed by violent movement beneath the surface. Most initially assumed Noah had simply slipped or become tangled in the tether line. Then the water turned red. Investigators later concluded that a large great white shark likely approached from below and delivered a single bite to Noah's upper leg and pelvic region as he swam back toward the vessel. Unlike Unlike what many people imagine, the shark did not continue attacking. After the bite, it disappeared. But that single bite was devastating. Crew members immediately threw flotation devices into the water and pulled Noah back aboard within moments. He had lost consciousness by the time they got him on deck. Witnesses later described crew members desperately applying pressure to the wounds while the captain turned toward shore and radioed emergency services. To me, this is the most devastating part of the whole thing. Everyone did exactly what they were supposed to do after the moment Noah entered the water. Nobody delayed. The reality was just brutal. His injuries were too massive to survive. Even with paramedics waiting at the harbor and trauma surgeons working on him the second he hit the hospital, Noah died just a few hours later. The post-mortem examination documented catastrophic injuries to the upper leg and pelvic region, major vascular trauma, extensive soft tissue damage, and hemorrhagic shock caused by massive blood loss. Investigators ultimately concluded that the single bite was responsible for the fatal injuries. Authorities reviewed onboard video footage and witness statements to reconstruct the timeline. The footage confirmed that Noah had voluntarily entered the water moments before the attack. Wildlife officials were never able to identify the specific shark involved, and no unusual shark activity was reported in the area afterward. No further release of the footage was allowed by authorities. But if you think entering an animal's territory in the wild is risky, this next story is way harder to swallow. It happened at a wildlife facility in northern Australia, and the victim was an expert who literally taught people how to stay safe around dangerous animals. It was May 18, 2015, at a wildlife sanctuary in northern Australia. Days of heavy rain had swollen nearby creeks, flooded low-lying ground, and pushed murky water beyond its normal banks. Staff spent the morning inspecting enclosures, monitoring water levels, and adjusting routines as conditions continued to deteriorate. 41-year-old Mandy Andrea Franklin had spent nearly 8 years working at a wildlife rehabilitation facility. She originally entered the field after a back injury ended her career in hospital security. Friends described her as dependable, organized, and almost obsessive about safety procedures. According to her family, Mandy wasn't reckless. If anything, she was the person constantly reminding everyone else to slow down and follow the rules. Part of her job involved inspecting sections of property that bordered natural habitat where rehabilitated animals were sometimes released. Following several days of heavy rain, staff discovered erosion and storm damage along a fence line running beside a tidal creek. The damage wasn't urgent enough to close operations, but it needed to be documented before repairs could begin. The creek wound through dense mangroves before connecting to larger river systems that eventually emptied into the coast. Saltwater crocodiles were known to move through the area, especially after flooding pushed animals into unfamiliar territory. Because of that, staff were instructed to work in pairs whenever inspections took place near the water. Earlier that week, workers reported seeing large slide marks on muddy sections of the creek bank. Wildlife officers advised employees to remain alert around the water's edge until conditions returned to normal. Looking back, those warnings feel important because they showed the danger was there. Nobody just knew exactly where. Late that afternoon, Mandy and groundsman Jake Torres headed out to inspect the damaged fence line. They spent nearly an hour photographing erosion, checking posts, and documenting areas requiring repair. According to Jake, Mandy repeatedly reminded him to stay focused because the muddy ground had become slippery after the rain. Around 5:45 p.m., the pair reached a section where part of the fence had partially collapsed toward the creek. Mandy moved closer to examine erosion beneath one of the posts, while Jake remained several yards behind, recording measurements. What happened next occurred so fast that Jake later struggled to describe it clearly. One moment, Mandy was focused on the damaged fence. The next, something exploded out of the water. Jake told investigators he initially thought part of the creek bank had collapsed. Only after he heard Mandy scream did he realize a large crocodile had seized her leg and dragged her toward the water. The force knocked Mandy off balance almost immediately. She tried grabbing nearby vegetation while Jake ran forward and attempted to pull her back. The two fought against the animal together, though the struggle lasted only a matter of seconds before the crocodile began rolling. The muddy bank gave way beneath them, and Jake lost his grip. Mandy was pulled into the creek as the crocodile disappeared beneath the surface with her. And that's the part that stays with me. Jake wasn't standing there watching helplessly. He actually tried to save her, but there are situations where human strength simply isn't enough. Jake immediately radioed for help and continued searching the water from the shoreline, hoping she might resurface. Emergency crews arrived shortly afterward, but responders faced a dangerous problem. The crocodile was still believed to be in the area, and visibility in the flooded creek was almost non-existent. Search operations continued through the evening and resumed at first light the next morning. 2 days days later, recovery teams located Mandy's remains downstream among dense mangrove vegetation. Investigators concluded that she survived the initial bite, but ultimately drowned after being pulled underwater during the attack. The examination also documented extensive crushing injuries and multiple fractures consistent with a large saltwater crocodile. Mandy's story shows how unpredictable nature can be. She followed procedures, recognized risks, and still crossed paths with an apex predator at exactly the wrong moment. The final case is different. This time, nearly every warning was ignored. It was August 12, 2013, in South Luangwa National Park, Zambia. The dry season had reduced much of the landscape to dusty floodplains and shrinking waterholes, concentrating wildlife into predictable corridors. As the afternoon heat faded, predators began emerging from the shade, moving through the tall grass in search of food before nightfall. 36-year-old Andre Whitaker had traveled there to photograph the landscape. He ran a small photography business specializing in dramatic wildlife and sunset imagery. Personally, I think Andre's biggest weakness was the same thing that made him successful. He was willing to go places that more cautious photographers avoided. South Luangwa is heavily regulated, and most visitors travel with licensed guides. Andre had arranged guided activities for most of his trip, but on this particular afternoon, he had moved off on his own during a period when his guide was not present, a decision that would prove fatal. He planned to capture untouched scenes without vehicles, crowds, or signs of human activity before rejoining his camp before dark. Earlier that afternoon, Andre noticed vultures circling above a section of tall grass near a dry riverbed. Experienced guides know that's often a sign that a carcass is nearby. Instead of leaving the area, Andre saw an opportunity for rare footage. He later recorded several clips while walking toward the location, occasionally speaking to the camera about the possibility of finding scavengers or predator activity. To me, this is where the tragedy really starts, because Andre had no idea what he was walking into. Hidden in the vegetation was a partially consumed wildebeest carcass. Investigators later learned that lionesses had been feeding there earlier in the day. Andre never saw them. Around 5:30 p.m., he set up a video camera overlooking the riverbed while adjusting a second camera a short distance away. The recovered footage showed several minutes of ordinary landscape shots, wind moving through the grass, birds calling in the distance, nothing that seemed unusual. Then, in the background of the video, movement appeared. At first, it was easy to miss. A lioness moving low through the grass behind Andre, then another shape farther back, watching. But what gets me is that when investigators reviewed the footage afterward, the danger seemed obvious. However, Andre did not look in that direction. Investigators later concluded that the lionesses likely viewed him as a threat near an active feeding site. Witness reports and evidence from the scene suggested the animals remained concealed until Andre unknowingly moved too close to the carcass. The attack happened almost instantly. One lioness exploded from the grass and struck Andre from behind. The impact knocked him to the ground before he could react. The camera shook violently as equipment toppled over. For several seconds, the footage captured only flashes of grass, dust, and movement while Andre shouted for help. Like most big cats, the lioness immediately targeted the neck and shoulder area. Investigators later determined that Andre survived the initial attack and attempted to fight back, but the injuries quickly became overwhelming. The camera continued recording audio for several minutes after disappearing into the grass. Investigators later used those recordings, along with physical evidence at the scene, to reconstruct much of what happened. By the time the lionesses retreated, Andre had suffered catastrophic injuries. His absence was not noticed until later that evening when he failed to return to his lodge as scheduled. Search teams located his abandoned equipment the following morning. Andre was found nearby, but he had already succumbed to his injuries. The post-mortem examination documented severe trauma to the neck, shoulders, and upper torso, extensive vascular injuries, traumatic shock, and massive blood loss. Investigators ultimately concluded that hemorrhagic shock caused by the attack was the primary cause of death. Due to the disturbing footage that was captured, it was not further shared outside his family. What stands out to me is how small the original mistake was. Andre wasn't provoking the lions. He wasn't trying to get close to them. He simply followed signs of animal activity into an area where a pride was actively feeding and never realized the predators were already watching him. The next case is the complete opposite. On a crowded river in Botswana, dozens of people watched the disaster unfold in real time and couldn't do a thing to stop it. It was October 14, 2018, in the Sundarbans mangrove forest along the Bangladesh-India border. The weather was hot and humid, with temperatures near 90 degrees Fahrenheit and a falling afternoon tide exposing muddy banks and narrow channels. Local fishing boats moved through the waterways while wildlife patrols continued warning visitors about recent tiger activity in the area. 26-year-old Leon Cook drove a forklift in Bremen and ran a small live stream channel sharing his off-the-beaten-path vacations. His 3,000 followers loved his unique travel spots, but Leon's outdoor experience was mostly limited to European hiking trails and city exploring. To me, this is where the real danger hid. He relied entirely on his phone and online forums, assuming that if a place was on a map, it was safe enough to explore alone. Leon had traveled to eastern India specifically to explore the Sundarbans, drawn by online descriptions of the world's largest mangrove forest and its reputation as one of the few places where tigers regularly hunt in tidal waters. His plan involved following exposed mudbanks during low tide while live streaming his journey through areas that most tourists could only observe from authorized boat tours. He viewed the expedition as an opportunity to create compelling content that would distinguish his channel from conventional travel vlogs, despite having no experience with tidal navigation or dangerous wildlife encounters. The Sundarbans is a maze of shifting channels where 500-pound Bengal tigers have adapted to hunt in the water. These apex predators use the dense mangroves as perfect camouflage, swimming between islands and ambushing prey at speeds over 35 miles per hour. I honestly find it hard to understand how Leon ignored the red flags here. Local boat operators explicitly warned him not to enter the mangroves without a guide, pointing out how easily solo travelers get lost when the tides shift. Signs in multiple languages warned of deadly wildlife and unstable mudflats, and that very morning, fishermen found fresh tiger tracks right along his planned route. Everything told him to turn back, but he went anyway. Leon began filming during the evening low tide, following GPS coordinates he had found online. For nearly 40 minutes, he crossed the exposed mudflats, excited about exploring an area few visitors ever reached. As he moved farther from safety, he brushed off warnings about the incoming tide and the dangers of the Sundarbans. The situation changed instantly when he stepped into a hidden patch of soft mud. His right leg sank deep into the sediment, and every attempt to pull free only trapped him further. The camera captured his increasingly desperate struggle as the tide slowly began moving back into the area. Approximately 10 minutes after becoming trapped, Leon's headlamp picked up movement along the mangrove edge roughly 30 yards away. The livestream audio captured splashing sounds as something large moved through the shallow water nearby, though the footage itself showed little more than darkness and shifting shadows. Watching his reaction, it's heartbreaking to see his attempts to stay calm for his audience become increasingly strained as the terrifying reality of his situation finally sets in. The attack came without warning. There was no slow approach, no prolonged moment of eye contact, just the sudden sound of movement through shallow water, and then the stream cut to chaos. The footage became useless almost immediately. The camera jerked sideways, caught mud and sky, and went still. The audio continued for a short time afterward before going silent. Search teams were dispatched after Leon's stream went dark, but coordinating a response in the Sundarbans after nightfall is genuinely difficult. The maze of tidal channels, the lack of roads, and the ongoing presence of tigers in the area meant that a safe search couldn't begin until first light the following morning. Teams reached the site by boat and found evidence of the attack. Recovery teams later located Leon's remains about 200 yards away. The examination revealed severe neck and upper body injuries consistent with a Bengal tiger attack. Investigators concluded that fatal damage to major blood vessels and the upper spinal region caused his death. The live stream was immediately shut down by the platform due to its high graphic content, violating the platform's terms and conditions.